Beyond the tragic health hazards and human consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic is the economic uncertainties and disruptions that have resulted into a significant cost to the global economy. Now, the United Nations Trade and Development Agency, also known as UNCTAD, put the cost of the outbreak at about $2 trillion in 2020.
Yes, well, most central banks, finance ministries and independent economic experts around the world have taken solace in the prediction that the impacts might be sharp but short-lived and economic activities would return to normal thereafter. This line of thought mirrors the thinking of the events that shaped the 2007 global financial crisis. However, though, considering the tumultuous events that COVID-19 has spread across the globe, cut across every facet of human existence, the consequences may linger far beyond what we think. Joining us now to speak on the economic challenges Nigeria faces and what can be done to offset the effects is economist and associate director at UNCTAD, Michael Ango. Michael, good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. If we were to get into the meat and bones of it, I know that we touched on the 2007-2008 financial crisis, but if we were to look back, we would definitely identify the financial crisis, but also the 1930s Great Depression. How do you think COVID-19 fits into that? Is it as worse? Is it as bad as those ones, or is it not as bad? Where would you think you would rank COVID-19 in with those financial disasters?
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to your studio. Just a quick one before I start. I'm not an economist. I'm actually a lawyer and a tax practitioner. Maybe I'll study
my apologies.
Later in my life.
But you are Michael Ango, I hope?
Yeah, happiest. Yes, I am Michael
Yes,
Ango.
okay, so we've done something right.
Subdued one at that. Yeah. Well, you know, first and foremost, I wasn't here in 1930. You weren't here too. What we read in the books was that, you know, there was a global depression in 1930. It affected the global economy significantly. But I think our world today is entirely different from what it was in 1930. So I don't think that we can look back to 1930 for too many lessons. Maybe we can look back to 2007 and 2008 and say to ourselves, what were the lessons that we could have learned then, and then how do we apply them to aid us in dealing with what we're facing. But having said that, you know, what happened in 2007 and 2008 did not lead to a shutdown of economics. What we've seen today is that economies have had to typically shut down because, again, you know, activities, human movement, and business activities will lead to the spread of the virus. So I think this is really novel in the sense that it's actually a novel coronavirus, and it's brought novel challenges with it. But again, you know, there will always be things that one can pick up. And so for me, sitting from where I am, I think for any government looking to deal with the impact of the coronavirus, I think the first thing you have to look at is that what can the government do on its own to essentially boost the economy after the pandemic subsides, which we hope it will in a short while. And there are things to do. You know, first and foremost, governments, need to look at what they have in terms of their expenditure profiles. They need to look at their budgets. In Nigeria, we've essentially had to cut our budget, not significantly, but again, you know, the Ministry of Finance has had to cut the budget. They've sent a revised appropriation act or bill to the National Assembly. So what government is saying is that, look, the previous projections that we've made in terms of what we wanted to put into the economy in 2020 have had to be cut down. But I think the major issue that will confront government as it goes is how do you deal with a revenue shortfall, significant revenue shortfall that will come from things like, you know, cut in oil prices, global oil prices. We had a budget projection of $57 per barrel. Today, oil is selling at sub 30. How do we deal with that? I think for me, the first place where government needs to go to is to say, look, there are certain things that we need to shrink in terms of our expenditure. And thankfully, what this coronavirus has done is that it's shown us that there's several things that, things we're used to doing that we probably could do without. So, a very quick example I'll give is the fact that in Nigeria, we're used to having, meetings, physical meetings and all of that, government officials, National Economic Council meeting, Federal Executive Council meetings. But in the last 2-3 days, I've seen, the Governors Forum has had meetings online. I saw that on Twitter. I've seen the Federal Land Revenue Service meet online. So essentially what it means is that there are certain, attributes, or there are certain things that we've done over time that if we take a second look at them, we could really change our behavior, our consumption patterns and all of that. But again, that is just one side of it. The truth is that when the pandemic is done, there will be consequences. There will be consequences at 3 levels. The first level, like I mentioned, is at the level of government, which will see its revenues shrink. The second level will be at the level of business. So business hasn't operated. There's been a basic shutdown in business activity. Manufacturing is not producing. Services and all of that have slowed down. Hospitality and aviation have really taken a major hit. What happens after that? Are these businesses going to be able to continue to pay their staff salaries? Are they going to be able to continue to meet their obligations? Loans taken from the banks and all of that. Then at the last level is going to be at the individual level. Certainly there would be people who would lose employment. There would be persons whose revenue, those in the informal sector, who have not been able to go out and earn their daily bread, and all of that. So these are things that will confront us. But again, the good thing is that, from what our government has done, I can see that there has been some forward thinking. There have been some palliative measures that have been introduced or announced, and then some of them already been implemented. Things like the conditional cash transfers to the poorest of the poor as we see it. We've had the 500 billion, COVID-19 intervention fund that has been proposed to upgrade our health facilities and all of that. So there has been some activity. What needs to happen is implementation. Okay. I'm hoping that when all this is done, we will begin to,
Yes, Michael, you have actually touched on so much there that it almost makes it impossible to, throw in these questions. But let's even talk about some of the measures that government has put in place, even before COVID-19 showed up, talking about, bolstering aggregate demand through increased government spending and tax cuts for businesses. Let's look at the SMEs, for example, the small and medium enterprises. They were exempted from company income tax, while medium-sized businesses were revised downwards from 30 to 20%. Now, with COVID-19 thrown in the mix, do you think there might be a need to actually, review some of these measures further downwards, and what implications that would have on the economy?
Well, the Minister of Finance was here a few days ago, and she said that, fortuitously, the Nigerian government had, without even knowing that COVID-19 was going to come, had passed the Finance Act. And the Finance Act did some very important things, which is, like you mentioned, exempting small businesses from payment of corporate taxes, and then reducing the corporate tax rate for medium-sized businesses. What the Finance Act didn't do is to exempt or provide any, exemptions for the large corporates, and that is understandable. But again, the Minister of Finance has already said that government is not looking at reducing taxes, and I can understand where they're coming from. At this stage, your major revenue earner has gone down. Would you be wanting to cut taxes for companies that, in your view, can pay the taxes? I think what should rather happen is government should incentivize businesses. So, for example, we have the emergency.
I'll have to put you on hold. Michael Ango is Associate Director and at Anderson Tax Consultant. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, we'll allow you land on that as you respond to other questions. Welcome back. You're watching The Morning Show, and we've been talking about the impact of COVID-19 on not just the Nigerian economy, but the global economy that is in a very, very dire situation right now. We've been speaking with Michael Ango, Director at Anderson Tax. Thanks for staying with us, and of course our viewers also. Now, you are trying to make a point about some of the moves that government made long before COVID-19, and we're talking about what impact these moves, which you say are actually fortuitous by themselves.
Yeah, so I will say that certain things had already been put in place, but going forward, there needs to be more in terms of things like, we've seen the emergency economic stimulus bill that is before our National Assembly now, that proposes to actually give tax cuts to companies that pay employee salaries. And so what will happen is that if you do not lay off your staff and you pay them salaries between March and December 2020, you will get a 50% rebate on that. The bill also proposes to put a moratorium on, mortgages, from the National Housing Fund and all of that. And then, of course, some duty exemptions. But, it can never be enough. In the United States, we've seen the $2 trillion stimulus package, which has been passed by the Congress in the United States. In other countries, we've also seen their governments trying to inject significant funds into the economy. So I think we need to see something like that. But how will that be done? We have a proposal from the Ministry of Finance for the Special Public Works Program, which is about 60 billion, a drop in the ocean, but at least something to start with. It proposes to engage 774,000 employees across the nation, 1,000 per local government, and it will pay them allowances and all of that. We need to see those kind of initiatives, but at a much larger scale. There are places we can go to. We need to touch on the digital economy in Nigeria. For long, we've talked about, diversifying our economy. Kill corruption, corruption will kill us. I paraphrase it and say, if we don't kill our dependence on oil, our dependence on oil will kill us. So we need to look at other areas in the economy where we have comparative advantage. And, we have a fine gentleman in the Ministry of Digital Economy who's saying a lot of things. He's put out policies. I think now government needs to look very closely at the digital economy. It is one area where we have a comparative advantage. So I can talk to things like, for example, video conferencing platforms and all of that. Why can't we have Nigerian companies design video conferencing platforms that will rival the Skypes, the WebEx and all of that, and then localize it here, and then, ensure that all government agencies, for example, use such, platforms for their meetings and all of that. We can have people, create apps, young people set up apps and all of that, that will, for example, take over the conditional cash transfer, where we saw a few days, that government was in its own wisdom trying to reach the poorest of the poor, but, the optics weren't too good, making payments on the table. We can have, app developers set up apps where, you don't even need the internet, you can use the USSD code and all of that. So there are certain things that we really can do. We can look at agric. We need to bring in technology into our agric sector. The agric sector on its own contributes about 22% of GDP, but we hardly see any significant revenue coming from there. So we need to look at the agric value chain. We need to look at things like, processing. We need to look at marketing, logistics. How do people move produce from the hinterlands into, the urban areas and all of that? And there are models that we can adopt. Essentially, we need to have a 360 view of thinking. We need to sit down, we need to say to ourselves that the things we've been doing are either not working or they're not working well enough. And then, so how can we do things differently? The great thing about this COVID-19 is that as much as it's a challenge, it also provides opportunities.
Nigeria has a growing gig economy, that's non-permanent jobs, and informal sector that contributes about 65% to the economy. Now, their income generating capacity has been, gravely affected, and that's the knock-on effect on consumption capacity. What do you see playing out? Because some experts believe that the impact of the COVID-19 on global economy may last way longer than 2020. What kind of measures in the long term and in the medium term do you think government should put in place very quickly, especially in the tax area where it is your turf? You understand that area very. What should be putting in place very quickly?
Okay, I think let us also not be too pessimistic. Okay, let us have some kind of bounded optimism. Yes, there are sectors that have been significantly impacted by the COVID-19 crisis, but as soon as the crisis is over, economic activities will rebound, and I think that what will happen is that consumption will go back to its pre-pandemic levels and all of that. Of course, there would have been then this period where people didn't earn income and all of that, and you can't wish that away. But I think what we need to see is that government then needs to say to itself, globally and in Nigeria, how do we target specific sectors? What are these sectors? So yes, you've mentioned the informal sector, but the challenge we have with the informal sector is how do you even begin to give incentives to informal? I think the real issue is not how do you bring those people in the informal sector into the formal sector? How do you, for example, ensure things like financial inclusion and all of that? Sometimes we tend to think that the the small trader who sells, street want to have a bank account. Maybe not. Maybe it does actually want to have a bank account, and then you can then bring him into the informal sector. If you then bring him into the informal sector, then you can quickly target him and say, okay, look, I can give you a loan, whether it's 100,000, 50,000, and all of that. That has been done to some extent with, with the trader money, the farmer money, and all of that. Those are initiatives that I think need to be ramped up. In Nigeria, especially, we need to then set up microcredit schemes. The CBN has said it's set aside 50 billion naira for families and businesses that have been significantly impacted by the COVID-19. The question is, how do you then get people who are not literate or who don't have any form of economic education? How do you get them to apply for those loans? So I think that what government then needs to do is to say, look, whether it's doing the community thing like we see with the conditional cash transfers, going to meet community leaders and all of that, or essentially saying to these people, in the language that they understand, come to us and we'll help you and all of that with whether it's interest-free loans and all of that. It's going to be an interesting, development to watch as things unfold. But I'm optimistic that we will weather the storm, and I sincerely believe that government does the right things. If it stays focused, then probably, before the third quarter of 2020 or fourth quarter of 2020, we'll be looking back at the pandemic and saying, well, it was a challenge, but it brought its own opportunities, and we've been able to harness these opportunities.
Hi, Michael. I think we have 1 minute left. I was really keen to ask you a question. I'm really happy you mentioned market money and other initiatives where the federal government is making sure that people's immediate repayments have been frozen for the next 3 months. One thing I wanted you to answer, though, in around 30 seconds is what you think the legacy of COVID-19 will be in Nigeria, whether or not you think it would be completely negative or whether or not there are positive aspects.
I think it all depends on our destinies in our hands. So one thing that COVID-19 has shown us is that the world is more interconnected than we think it is. So something that started in a small province in China has shut down the entire global economy. I think for me, my hope and expectation is that the legacy of COVID-19 will be that it will have changed our orientation, it will have changed our mindset, it would have totally weaned us of dependence on oil revenues, and hopefully it will refocus government on the areas of our economy that can sustain us in the next 5, 10, 20, 50 years. Agriculture, manufacturing, information communication technology, the digital economy, services.
Michael Ango, we have run out of time, but it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today on The Morning Show.